All right. Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to part 2 of our series, which is called Groundwork for Change. We're really excited to have you here. And on behalf of the organizing groups, I want to say thank you for joining. The groups that put this event together are ClimateFast, DrawdownTO, EcoJust Food Network, and Green Thumb's Growing Kids. So thank you all for being here. You can continue to use the chat to introduce yourselves while we go through a few initial rules about the event, and then we're gonna hear from our speakers. So I really hope, and I want to start by saying this, I hope you're safe and you're doing well. I know it's been a very difficult time for some communities across North America. So glad to have you here and glad you can be with us. You will see in the chat some initial rules. We'll also share a slide shortly, just to let you know how you can participate in this event. You won't be able to unmute yourself. And so instead, what you can do is use the chat and use the Zoom reactions. And oh, there we go. We have just the chat here. We also really ask that you respect each other, respect our speakers, and respect the organizers, and you come in with an open mind. We do want to hear from you, so you will be able to ask questions. You can put the questions in the chat, and then at the end of the event, I'll be asking them to all of our speakers who are going to stay for the Q&A. Thank you very much. I think the slide will be repeated in the chat afterwards. I quickly will introduce myself, maybe, so you know who you're seeing. My name is Aliénor, or Allie. I go by she or pronouns. I'm a youth climate activist. I've mostly organized with the Fridays for Future Toronto movement. So we are the kids that have been striking from school and occupying the streets of Toronto to demand more climate justice. And I am really honored to be here and really thankful that I'm given the opportunity to introduce you to our speakers. I'll also say that I am a settler in so-called Canada, and you've heard probably at all events you've attended, at least recently, something called a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements were very new to me when I first moved to Canada, and it took me time to understand how I felt about them and why we do them. But I want to say that land acknowledgements are very, very, very far from what we need to have a real relationship with Indigenous peoples. However, with a country that has initially and always attempted to erase the Indigenous knowledge and existence into existence of Indigenous peoples on this land, this is kind of a first step to address this attempted erasure. And in a country where we initially thought we were the first to find this continent, it's important for us to remember that these lands have been occupied far, far, far before the arrival of the settler state of Canada. So where I am right now is called Toronto or Toronto. It is the land of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and more recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And the land is actually ruled by the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, and it was actually an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe and also allied nations to peaceably share for the land and the resources on them. And so we are all treaty people, and we all must obey this treaty. So I encourage you to look more into it if you're interested. I also would like to acknowledge non-human beings who are also hosting us. Obviously the land, the air, the water nearby us, the animals and the plants. As we learned today, they are instrumental to our well-being, and so it's important for us to think of them as well. And finally, I want to voice my support for land defenders and Indigenous peoples across Canada. We know that they're subject to a lot of violence, and we know that right now they're also going through immeasurable grief as a lot of discoveries about residential schools are coming to light and being in the media, and there are no surprises for Indigenous communities, but they are painful. So I would also like to voice my support there. Today, we're going to be talking about the challenge and the promise of regenerative agriculture. We know that agriculture is impacted by climate change. We also know that the way we currently practice agriculture is actually creating more climate change. And so we know that we have to change the way we practice agriculture. Today, we're going to be exploring regenerative agriculture and what it promises for us. I find this very hopeful, and I'm happy to be part of this event and looking forward to it because I often feel overwhelmed by the climate crisis. And I know a lot of other people do. So tonight is going to be about the solutions, about the way food, which is a huge part of our life, but maybe we don't think about it enough, can be part of the solution. Thank you very much for tuning in. I look forward to your questions. Please continue to have them in the chat. We'll ask them at the end. And we're going to start with a short film. Maybe you'll recognize some of the faces as part of the film that was produced by Conservation International and is titled Nature is Speaking. Thank you again for joining us. That was a powerful way to start. I really appreciate the mention of respect because this is really what it's about, and also the reminder that we do depend on the soil. To give us a little more knowledge here and to get us started off, I'm really excited to be able to introduce you to Isaac Crosby. Isaac comes from a small farming community about 30 minutes south of Windsor in Ontario called Harrow. And he is a proud Ojibwe Black Canadian and looks forward to sharing his histories. He studied landscape horticulture tech, that's difficult for me to say, at Humber College and currently leads urban agriculture programming at the Evergreen Brick Works and actually does that virtually right now. He incorporates his education in traditional First Nations farming to grow great crops, to teach others, and to do his part in saving the earth and really in saving all of us that depend on the earth. So Isaac, thank you for being with us, and we look forward to hearing what you have to teach us.
All right, well, thank you very much, Anine, everybody. Once again, my name is Isaac Crosby. I come from the Ojibwa of Anderden from Southwestern Ontario. A brief history about us. We are a farming community. Our history is the Ojibwe people took in and took care of the Black people who came north, the fugitive slaves, mixed and married and produced people that look like me. Some people are lighter skinned, blah, blah, blah. But both people were farmers and cared for the earth. So in my blood comes this pure farmer blood, pure farmer blood. So living up here in Toronto, or Toronto, I am teaching urban agriculture at Evergreen Brick Works. So my teachings are more of an Indigenous land-based spin. So I always call it Indigenous agricultural techniques. So looking at the whole regenerative soil, regenerative agriculture, you have to know Indigenous people, we've been doing this for millennia, for a long, long time. Before the coming of the colonizers, the settlers, we've been taking care of this area for a long time using these Indigenous agricultural techniques, such as, everyone talks about the three sisters, right? We did a lot of intercropping, making sure we did a lot of agroforesting as well. We made sure that we took care of this land mass, especially those of us that are part of the Dish with One Spoon covenant, the treaty that we have with each other. Because if you look at the land, look around the Great Lakes, at one point in time, you can see a bit of it now, that you can see how beautiful it was. How it was all populated with all these trees and animals, and there's probably fields around certain areas of crops. But now, you're looking around the Great Lakes and you see a lot of pollution. And you look at all the farms that are around the Great Lakes that are actually polluting the Great Lakes and making the soil turn to dirt. We never had that before. So now we have this that we have to deal with. So for me, working at Evergreen Brick Works, my first thing, if you see the garden behind me, that garden behind me did never look like that. I've been at Brickworks for about 4 or 5 years now. So about four or 5 years ago, if you would have seen this garden, it was not really a barren space. It had all these plants growing there. Some plants that were invasive species and plants are behaving badly, and some that are native. So what I had to do when I was asked to take over the spot was go back into my Indigenous agricultural technique, my heritage, and redo the spot. So in other words, I had to regenerate that soil that was there because the soil was in bad shape. So with that in mind, what I decided to do was to do the Three Sisters Mounds. So I did mounds. So the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash, you have to know. So you have sister corn, the first one. Then you have sister bean, who comes in next. And so sister bean pulls in the nitrogen from the air and stores it in the soil. And it helps to keep it in the soil. So all three of those crops work well together. So I did sunflower mounds because you have to know that there's a corn, beans, and squash, three sisters. There's sunflower beans and squash, and there's sunroot beans and squash. Each one does something different for your soil. Your corn, beans, and squash, for us, we call that's the real trendy one. That's our superfood. Everyone wants to get into their gardens nowadays, which is great. I'm trying to go for it because it will regenerate your soil because you need to do that. But for us, if we think our soil is contaminated, we'll do sunflowers as well to help decontaminate the soil. If we think our soil is too compact, we put sunchokes down. But people know them as Jerusalem artichokes, but not from Jerusalem. They're not an artichoke. They're part of the sunflower family. All right. So at Brickworks, when I did that, I created about 7 sunflower mounds to help rejuvenate the soil. Then I did about 5 the corn, beans, and squash mounds to do the soil as well, and did that for a good 2 years. I just kind of moved it from spot to spot to make sure the soil was getting up to par for what I needed to be for the future growing on there. I will say this. That's the space now that you see behind me. I'll move my head so everyone can see. You can see it. Woohoo! We took that space. Well, I took that space and made it into a place where I teach indigenous agricultural techniques and how we who live in the city can actually use urban agriculture to do something to combat climate change, to do regenerative soil agricultural techniques. Because if we do not do that here, and we rely on other people to do it for us, it's not going to happen. Most people think you can't do that in the city, but you can. You can do a lot of things in the city. You just got to put your mind to it. I mean, look at me at Evergreen Brick Works doing indigenous agricultural techniques there, creating these gardens around the city even, and showing people how you can take back our gardens and take back our farmland and do what you need to do to help this earth. Most people go out there and they talk about earth helping, earth working. I tell people, earth working, we've been working the earth for far too long. It's now time to help the earth. And by helping this earth, regenerative agricultural techniques is going to help her. Because if we don't help her, like that video said, do you want to eat? Do you? Because I know I do. I don't want to feed people. So I got to do what I need to do to make sure that wherever I am on this earth, that I'm taking care of it. And that means that doesn't mean always just following First Nations way of doing it. If you are in other countries, follow what your people did before the onset of big farms. Follow what your people did before the onset of all these chemicals that were going to the soil. Because I tell you right now, everyone across the board, every culture across the board had some sort of regenerative agricultural techniques. It just so happens to be right now, we're all about permaculture, we're all about culture, which all trace their ways back to indigenous cultures. So when I talk about that, I make sure people go back to your cultures, learn about that, then come back and see how we can all work together. Because we will find something that's common with all of them. I mean, right now our common thing is climate change, right? So climate change is another one that we're working towards. I mean, within First Nations cultures, within us, we did a lot of different things with our gardens. We'd burn the fields, create our own biochar for the fields. That was always fun when you're a kid and you're able to play with fire. And then going down, one thing to tell people they don't know that we used to go down to Lake Erie for us and gather all the seaweed that was coming up, that was washing ashore. And we'd take the seaweed back to our farms, to our gardens, and chop it up nice and fine, and lay that in our gardens. We'd also go down and catch the fish. When we're building our mounds, or even bigger mounds, we'd go down and catch the fish and take the fish bones, the fish guts, the fish heads, and they will be laid inside of our soil, because that will help rejuvenate the soil as well. So by adding all this natural material to your soil will help rejuvenate it. We have to make sure that we get away from all the chemical stuff that is out there. I do my best to make sure that when I'm teaching people about gardening, that I teach them how to do more natural methods of pest control. If I can speak, it'd be great. Pest control and fertilizers, because the fertilizers and stuff and pesticides out there right now are chemicals. And we need to go back to do it with all natural, because when we put chemicals on the soil, our soil will become dirt, which will become dust, like that video says. And we are trying not to become dust, right? We're trying to make sure that this place we call Earth is left around for our future generations. And so by thinking about that, always having that in the back of your head, and you're thinking about that you should go forward and think about how you can actually take care of this Earth, how you can help this Earth by doing more regenerative agricultural techniques. When you're in your garden, or even when you're at someone else's garden, you can always I always make sure I look around and see what they're doing in their gardens, and I ask questions. Are you using chemicals? If you're using chemicals, why? Did you know about using tomato leaves for insecticide? Did you know about making your own homemade Miracle-Gro? That's not chemicals. Stuff like that. Or growing comfrey, growing certain plants to make compost tea out of, to make your plants a lot better, to grow faster, to grow stronger. And I found that in my journeys, a lot of people don't know about these certain things. They are still stuck on trying to find Roundup. They're still stuck on trying to find all these chemicals because they think the chemicals are going to be great for their plants. Like, yeah, it may be great for their plant, but it's also horrible for you. But you got to really think about it. If it's horrible for you, it's not great for the plant. You think it's great for the plant because you're going to get this beautiful, perfect tomato or a beautiful, perfect ear of corn. But guess what? It's full of chemicals. All you're doing is eating chemicals right now, and you're ruining the soil. And you don't want to ruin the soil. When you ruin the soil, there's nothing good's going to grow from it anymore. So we have to make sure that we put our thinking caps on and make sure that we regenerate the soil, so that the future generations of next year we have an even better crop than a year before. Most people, you can say, they will stop at better crops, right? And I'm like, no, you want better crops. You want to be able to go to your tomato plant, if you eat tomatoes, and pick it right off the tomato plant and eat it that way. If you spray it with chemicals, it's not going to work for you. You have to wash it off and do stuff like that, or let it soak. So I tell people, like I keep saying, you want to go for a more natural approach when it comes to regenerating your soil. Our soil in North America, if I remember correctly, has been so contaminated for the 1930s, 1940s. Now that's a long time ago. And we are now in 2021. And we're just now thinking about this. We're just now realizing, wow, regenerative soil, regenerative agriculture, we should start thinking about this. Yeah, we need to. Because after all those years of our soil here being destroyed, you've seen how forests are dying, you see how farmland is taken up. It is now time for us to go back, learn these skills, learn how to take care of the earth. And not be afraid to have weeds in your garden. That's one thing I want to make clear. Don't be afraid to have weeds in your garden, because guess what? Those weeds are also companion plants to other plants as well. They're doing something else. And when you're done with the weeds, you can always just cut the weeds up, chop them up, and put them back on the soil. Rejuvenate the soil that way. Remember, those weeds or those plants behaving badly are picking up nutrients and stuff like that from the soil already. So when you say thank you to them, and you utilize them and put them back on the soil, all they're going to do is break down into the soil and get the nutrients back to the soil and back to the plants. So I do my best not to take the plants behaving badly or the weeds out and get rid of them, i.e. back to the compost. I just chop them up right there and put them back on the soil. I'll bury them under. We have to make sure that we keep our minds on taking care of this earth, on taking care of ourselves, and making sure that we keep this earth around for the next 7 generations. As Indigenous people here in North America, or Turtle Island, we have been doing for millennia. When I put my weeds in the compost, I make sure there's no flower heads and no seeds. That's how I put my weeds in the compost. Flower heads and seeds, I will do something totally different with them. I will actually put them in hot water and use them that way. Before I think I have 1 minute left, I just want to say, please, when you're out there in your gardens, in your farming, regenerative agricultural techniques, Indigenous agricultural techniques for this part of the world will be your best friend. And I'll tell you right now, the garden behind me, that's all that is. There's no chemicals whatsoever in that garden. It's all using natural things I know from my family, from growing things, and making sure that that soil is healthy. The soil must be healthy. If the soil was not healthy, those plants would not look like that. They would look bad, very bad, very, very bad. I will say that it can be a challenge. It can be a challenge because we have been told to always use chemicals. Thank you very much. And take care, everyone. I'm still here though for question and answer.
Thank you very much, Isaac. I'm glad you're still here because there were many questions and I'm sure there will be many more. Thank you for actually answering some of them during your presentation. You did that so well. I really appreciated your energy and your call to us going back to what worked before and to what worked for the people that were here before. Very much appreciated. I also want to mention that Isaac has a Gardening with Brother Nature series on YouTube, and the link will be in the chat. So if you were really, like me, interested by what Isaac was saying, I think you should check it out after this event. Really happy that we can transition now to our next guest tonight. Mary Delaney is going to be speaking with us. Hi, Mary. Mary was a journalist and later a museum educator, and was researching North Pickering's involvement in the farmers' revolt. And that's when she realized she lived on rebellious lands. And Mary is also the mother of 3 environmentalists who say they would all willingly surrender their old farmhouse to a new generation of farmers once the land have been saved. So that's great to hear. And Mary today will be accompanying us to hear the story behind the movement that grew from a single protest against an airport to become a very powerful force of change for the preservation of nature. So we're going to discover the efforts of both Mary and the Land Over Landings fight on how they saved the land and the rich heritage of regenerative agriculture. Mary, thank you for being with us. We'd love to hear from you and then watch more about your work.
Thank you. Very, very happy to be here today, this evening. This is a 50-year-old story, as you were saying, Allie, and the people who originally tried to stop an airport outside of Toronto in North Pickering, they never would have imagined that something called climate crisis would probably have been the #1 reason to stop an airport and to save these important lands. This evening is about regenerative agriculture, and I have to say that that is very much just aspirational for us, because before we can do anything in that form of regenerative agriculture, we still do have to save these lands, which means the federal government has to cancel the airport once and for all. So I also wanted to say we've made this video because it is a very long story. Obviously, it's a complicated story, multiple levels of government. So we hope that this video that we put together will help tell the story in a more clear fashion. And I want to point out to you that behind me, by the way, the beautiful scene is actually behind me. If you look very carefully, at one point, you will see a bug fly by and the slight movement. After we made the video, we thought, oh my goodness, it looks like it's a green screen or a photograph because it's just so beautiful. But that's actually what it looks like out behind our General Secretary's house in the country. So thank you very much for this. And we now introduce the Accidental Oasis. There is a growing movement in Canada to save threatened areas of environmental concern. The Pickering federal lands should be among them. True, we're hardly wilderness, here inside the most populous, urban, and diverse region of the country, but that is precisely why we must be included. Ironically, in one respect, we're already protected, and have been for almost half a century. But this protection was completely accidental. The exact opposite of the original objective. Today, we're half farmland and half national park, right on Toronto's doorstep. How this came to be is a tale of vision in the wake of decades of negligence, waste, and entirely predictable unpredictability. It began in 1972, when 18,600 acres of farmland and thriving rural communities northeast of Toronto were expropriated for a major international airport that was never built. It was a time when aviation was the way of the future and the sky was the limit. But the airport faced fierce opposition. A grassroots movement, People or Planes, rallied farmers, artists, housewives, business people, politicians, hippies, and members of a burgeoning environmental movement, back when green was just a color, long before it was a way of life. POP, as it was known, succeeded in stopping the project in 1975, but the site remains in federal hands, just in case. Over the decades, there have been dozens of taxpayer-funded studies, most of them aimed at proving a business case for an airport. Not one has been successful. Over the years, buildings on the lands have only come down. Nothing has gone up. And people have all but disappeared from the landscape. Land Over Landings, successor to POP, was born in 2005 with the goal of preserving this rich farmland for future generations. We've held onto this objective like a dog with a bone, researching, advocating, educating, and lobbying to make it happen. 2013 and 2015 were milestones, when over half the lands in 2 parcels were transferred to the new Rouge National Urban Park, and so were protected. But the 2013 announcement was accompanied by another stunner. The airport was to be built after all, and within shouting distance of the brand new park. While nothing came of that announcement, the airport threat has never died and is regularly resurrected. We now focus our efforts on saving those remaining lands, some 9,000 acres still designated for an airport. Our mission is to convince Ottawa to stop all plans for an airport and to protect this irreplaceable natural resource in perpetuity. Meanwhile, Transport Canada continues leasing to agricultural, commercial, and residential tenants, and farming on the lands carries on. As neighboring areas rapidly urbanize, the lands, streams, forests, and windrows remain part of a natural heritage corridor, stretching 20 kilometers from Lake Ontario to the Oak Ridges Moraine. The site has become a de facto nature preserve. Around here, it's the stuff of legend that the only environmental assessment done on the lands before the shocking announcement of the airport and expropriation was a 3-day affair, conducted in winter with snow on the ground. It would be laughable if it hadn't been so negligent and contemptuous. A 2004 study for Transport Canada is the only public report that contains a description of the environmental features of the area. A landscape of rolling hills, farm fields, woodlots, and wetlands, partly on the Oak Ridges Moraine. The soils are recognized as Canada Land Inventory Class 1, a non-renewable resource, the best soil there is. Some of the healthiest watersheds in the Greater Golden Horseshoe are here, their headwaters springing from the southern slope of the moraine. The 2004 study found 142 flora species of concern on the lands and 50 species of fauna. And today, naturalized agricultural buffers provide food and shelter to pollinators and other insects. But perhaps the most significant feature is the absence of people living or working here. Highways and byways crisscross the lands, but aside from mostly seasonal farming, there is very little human imprint on the lands themselves, despite their peri-urban location. Those who visit never fail to note that they are also beautiful, an oasis in a sea of sprawl. You literally cross the boundary from concrete, asphalt, and noise to lush green and quiet. And we'd be remiss if we didn't mention what lies beneath the lands. Indigenous habitation over millennia has left a wealth of archaeological and cultural traces of the Wendat, who lived in large agriculture-based settlements. In the mid-70s, when airport construction seemed imminent, 2 locations saw rescue archaeological work. At the most important site, over 1 million artifacts were found. The Provincial Archaeology Unit has registered at least 81 sites and believes there to be many more. Most of the known sites have yet to be explored. It's a sad irony that the climate crisis that threatens us all will likely work in favor of our advocacy. There are reasons why all over the world airports are closing and new ones aren't being built. And this was a developing situation even before COVID. Aviation has an emissions problem and no ready solutions. A new airport anywhere during a climate crisis and post-COVID makes no earthly sense. To build one here, of all places, replacing prime farmland with asphalt and concrete would be unconscionable. More irony. Our battle is not with Ottawa alone. These days, we fight to get our local politicians to face facts. Oh, they pay lip service to climate change mitigation strategies, but behind the scenes, they're baking their support for a Pickering airport into the wording of policy statements and official plans. They are shameless in their crafting of this mixed message and appear to have no qualms about misleading the public. One further threat, although we consider it a long shot. If ever the lands were released, that is, no longer protected by federal statute, it's doubtful they could survive the crushing pressure on governments to rezone the land for urban development. If that happened, there would be a feeding frenzy. Now we all know, for every challenge, there is opportunity. And the saying holds true for these accidentally protected lands. If saved, they would continue to be a natural carbon sink, helping to offset the emissions of the surrounding rapidly growing metropolitan area, sequestering carbon through careful conservation practices and regenerative agriculture. And Land Over Landings has a clear vision of what these lands could be. We call it North Pickering Farms, the lands transformed into a regional food and agritourism hub, serving Canada's largest urban market. It would be a revived community, providing local food, exciting opportunities, secure jobs, and a healthy, sustainable future, creating over 2,100 jobs and $230 million in new annual economic activity. The vision includes an incubator center for training new farmers and a research center dedicated to resolving the challenges the agricultural sector faces as the planet warms. Canada could and should be leading the world in this research. The lands would become the ideal neighbor for Rouge National Urban Park, with its foundational pillars of nature, culture, and agriculture. Or better yet, these remaining lands could become part of the park. This has been a long fight, arguably the longest continuous protest movement in Canadian history. Now into our second and even third generation, we are advocates who have gone from fighting against something to fighting for something. It was the government of the first Prime Minister Trudeau that launched this saga half a century ago and accidentally protected these lands for a future in which the current Prime Minister Trudeau now has the opportunity to save them forever. The justification for expropriation was to allow the government to violate the rights of some, to make way for a project deemed to be for the good of all. Back in 1972, that common good was believed to be an airport. Today, we can't imagine a better public good than to protect these lands on purpose, for the right reasons, in perpetuity, before it's too late. An oasis of fresh food, fresh air, fresh water, and a reimagined, revitalized future for all.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mary, for introducing this video and for your participation in it, of course. It was incredible to hear about past movements. I'm always amazed. And what I take away from this, on top of the incredible potential of those lands and how grateful I am that they were protected, is how important organizing is and how important collective mobilization really is. And we actually shared with you folks in the chat an opportunity for you to start getting involved and message your elected officials. The lesson we have today is it matters. What we do matters. And when we get together and voice our support or opposition for policies and projects, they do matter. So thank you, Mary, again, for being with us.
Can I just say something? I'm not sure. I think the lands aren't protected.
Right. I mean,
yes. Okay, I'm sorry. You talked about a past movement and that the lands were protected, and I really don't want to leave the false impression. We still have 9,000 acres zoned for an airport, and that's what we still need to stop. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. Yes, sorry about that. I was just in awe of the whole project, but I didn't touch on the last part, which is we still have a lot of work to do. And going back to what I was saying, I believe maybe we can share it again actually in the chat because it might have been diluted by some messages in there, but we have a letter to your MP that you can add or you can send if you want to participate. It's a good way to get involved. Thank you, Mary, for adding that. We have been speaking about regenerative agriculture for about 40 minutes now, and I realize maybe some of us are not as familiar as others with what regenerative agriculture really means, what it actually means. I think both Isaac and Mary gave us elements of it, but let's have a little 101 video of what it is about. So hopefully this will be new knowledge for some of you, maybe just a reminder for others. But here is the video, What is Regenerative Agriculture?, which was produced and narrated by Charles Einstein.
Regenerative agriculture is a set of farming practices that increase biodiversity in soil organic matter. Currently, most agricultural practices are devastating to biodiversity. Even organic agriculture, while not as bad, still does more harm than good. Regenerative agriculture is a way to reverse this trend to actually make a positive impact on the land. So what does regenerative agriculture actually involve? Answering this question is actually pretty tricky, because the practices that work best largely depend on the land that's being worked with. So the variety of different practices border on infinity, a bit more than this video can cover. However, let's look at 3 common forms that regenerative agriculture can take. The soil is full of organisms which are helpful for plants. Some convert soil nitrogen into a plant-usable form. Some bring water to the plants that would otherwise be out of reach. Others loosen and aerate the soil, increasing water absorption and allowing plant roots to penetrate deeper. When soil is turned over by a machine, most of these organisms are killed, so the crops must rely on chemical fertilizer, which ends up leaching into the water. Central to no-till farming is to not do that. Instead of tilling, plant cover crops whose roots break up the soil. Let the worms aerate the soil and bring down nutrients. Keep the soil covered with an organic mulch, which will break down over time, adding more organic matter to the soil. From the release of methane to clearing forests for pasture land, cattle raising is known for being very environmentally destructive. But this is not inherent to grazing animals. If the right practices are put in place, enormous amounts of carbon can be sequestered into the ground, soil can be built, and even desertification can be reversed in a matter of years. Here's how it works. The growth of grass tends to start slow, accelerate, and slow down again. This middle area is where it accrues the most biomass the most efficiently. If it's eaten before it gets to this point, its growth will never speed up. This is what happens with traditional pastured animals. They eat all the grass, which doesn't have the chance to grow back fast enough before getting eaten again, and we have overgrazing. This leads to soil erosion, drought, and desertification. But if the animals are kept in a tightly packed herd, like they used to be in nature, the grass has time to grow before being eaten. All that biomass in the grass is carbon that comes from the air. Not all of the grass gets eaten, however. Some of it gets pooped on and trampled, which ends up creating the perfect conditions for new topsoil to be built. This ends up happening incredibly quickly. This is one of the most complex and location-dependent practices there are. I will therefore be overgeneralizing a bit. It always starts with observing a local forest and the relationships between everything in it. The plants, the animals, the fungi, the landscape, the soil, the water, and then recreating these relationships in a way that's just as ecologically resilient, but produces more food. Food forests are often thought of as comprising 7 layers: the root layer, the ground cover layer, the herb layer, the shrub layer, the low tree layer, the high tree layer, and the vine layer. Every one of these layers either produces some sort of food or medicine, or is in some way helpful to the system as a whole. The The plants are mostly perennials and include as many native species as possible. These three examples of regenerative agriculture, plus all the rest of them, all have something in common. Whereas in conventional agriculture, you seek to create as many of one thing as possible, in regenerative agriculture, you seek to create as many relationships between things as possible. You are one of those things. What sort of relationship with the land do you want to foster?
Well, hopefully that was helpful. Just gonna wait until we end the video. There we go. Hopefully this was helpful. It was a good reminder to me. And I actually heard it echoed a few of the elements that some of our speakers said. I heard the plea for us not to use chemicals, and Isaac gave us examples of other natural methods we could use. And I also heard the call to observe first, learn from nature. It is something Indigenous peoples have done, and this is why we also have this call to go back to traditional local knowledge first. And you can find again this video if you want to maybe share it with family or friends, get them thinking about these topics. Our tech team has been sharing it in the chat. Now we will go to our next speaker, who is Darrin Qualman. Darrin works for the National Farmers Union and is a former farmer in Saskatchewan. Darrin also has degrees in political science, biology, and history. He is uniquely qualified to show how federal agriculture policy has decreased farmers' net incomes while also pushing for maximum yields through climate-destroying chemical-intensive agriculture, and machinery inputs destined for experts. So Farmers for Climate Solutions is a coalition in which National Farmers Union is also a part of. And I take that Darrin might also be mentioning that to us tonight. Darrin, thank you for being with us. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Allie, and thank you to Isaac and Mary, and thanks for that great video. So I'm just going to share my screen here. And, there, Allie, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, so my name is Darrin Qualman. I'm the Director of Climate Crisis Policy and Action with the National Farmers Union. And I'm going to, in my 14 or 15 minutes, just cover three things. I'm going to talk about the NFU and Farmers for Climate Solutions, so you get a sense of the organization and the coalition and the way we are working to bring emissions reduction and climate resilience policies. I'm going to give you a little introduction to agricultural emissions themselves so you can understand how Canadian farms produce greenhouse gases. And then I'm going to talk about the policy solutions that Farmers for Climate Solutions and NFU have put forward to reduce those emissions and make our farms more sustainable and resilient. So the National Farmers Union has been around for about 52 years. We're an organization of farm families from coast to coast, and including 2 of the 3 territories as well. Farmers for Climate Solutions is a coalition of 22 organizations, farm organizations and farmer supporting organizations, and it was founded just over 1 year ago. So the National Farmers Union has been active on climate issues since the 90s, actually. We had a national convention focused on climate change in agriculture almost 20 years ago. Recently, we've come out with 2 reports that analyze the problem of agricultural emissions and climate change and put forward some solutions. So in 2019, we came out with our report, Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis, a transformative strategy for Canadian farms and food systems, where we connected the dots between farm income, emissions, and a whole suite of solutions that could quite easily reduce agricultural emissions quite dramatically. And then in 2021, we came out with a follow-up report called Imagine If, a vision of a near zero farm and food system for Canada. And in that report, we positioned the reader in 2030 we imagined that all of the very positive policies had been implemented, that emissions had been cut, that a regenerative agriculture and agroecology and other transformative changes had occurred. And we sort of walked the reader through just how good things could be in our food system if we just acted on what we know and implemented the policies we need. If you want to know more about some of the analysis, about the NFU, about some of the solutions, on our website, nfu.ca, there are 3 short 2-page fact sheets that are a really good entry point, and they pick up on a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today. Farmers for Climate Solutions, again, a coalition, the NFU and several organizations founded it just over a year ago, and we've grown quite dramatically and had a lot of policy success. Here are a couple of the reports they've put together. The first one is about COVID recovery, and the other is a set of solutions that I'm going to go into in more detail that show how we can alter practices and how federal programs can partner with farmers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. So I just want to give you a sense of how agriculture produces greenhouse gas emissions. It's not often well understood. People think of carbon dioxide, but that isn't the real big picture when it comes to farming. So a bit of review, some of you may know, there are 3 main greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, CH4, which is about 28 times more powerful than CO2 when it comes to causing warming, and nitrous oxide, N2O. So this is a graph of Canadian agricultural emissions over the past 28 years, 1990 to 2018. The units are millions of tons of CO2 equivalent. And there's a lot of different colors there, a lot of different kinds of emissions, but really it comes down to 3 main categories of greenhouse gases. So starting in the middle there, those red bands, those are carbon dioxide emissions mainly from fuel. Then at the top, we've got methane emissions mostly from cattle. And at the bottom, we've got a lot of nitrous oxide emissions mainly from nitrogen fertilizer use. So just look at those red emissions in the middle. That's CO2 from diesel fuel burnt in machinery, from natural gas to heat barns, etc., gasoline in trucks. That's the CO2 emissions. And as some of you know, CO2 emissions have gone up very dramatically. This is a long-term graph showing 800,000 years, and you can see the real spike in CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. Of course, that's not all agriculture, but those CO2 emissions from agriculture are contributing to that very dramatic and very dangerous spike we've created. At the top, those blue bands, that's emissions mostly from cattle, the methane that comes out of the mouths of cattle, and also methane and nitrous oxide from manure. And this is a graph of the last 10,000 years, just showing what humans have done in terms of the methane concentrations in the atmosphere. Again, this isn't just cattle. Oil and gas contributes to this. Rice paddy agriculture contributes to this, but cattle also make a significant contribution. You can see that we've more or less tripled the methane concentrations in the atmosphere. And down at the bottom, those green bands are the emissions from the production of nitrogen fertilizer and the use of nitrogen fertilizer. The main gas involved there is nitrous oxide. And this is a graph of 800,000 years of atmospheric nitrous oxide concentrations. And you see the real spike just in the last 100 years. And again, this is a greenhouse gas, very potent, about 265 times more potent than carbon dioxide when it comes to causing warming. So that's a little tour of where the emissions come from in agriculture. Again, unlike the rest of the economy, it's not mostly carbon dioxide from combustion of fossil fuels. It's mostly methane and nitrous oxide from sources such as livestock production and the use of nitrogen fertilizer. And Isaac talked about how things like fertilizer are incredibly difficult to manage in the environment. A lot of negative impacts. And the last thing I'll say about nitrogen fertilizer, we're using much more of it. This is a graph of nitrogen fertilizer use over the past approximately 80 years. And you can see that the amount of nitrogen that we're using in Canada is doubling and redoubling, and that's the main driver of the emissions increase we see. So the third part, I've shown you kind of where the problems are with regard to our emissions. The NFU and Farmers for Climate Solutions have proposed a lot of policy solutions, and we've really made a lot of progress. Farmers for Climate Solutions Coalition members got agriculture and climate change and emissions reduction into the throne speech, first time that had happened. Largely as a result, agriculture, climate change, and emissions reduction were then put into the mandate letter for the Minister of Agriculture and into Budget 2021. That budget included more than $200 million in new funding and several new programs, many of which Farmers for Climate Solutions had proposed to the government. So what did Farmers for Climate Solutions propose for Budget 2021? 4 programs, and all of these really dovetail really well with regenerative agriculture. The first one is nitrogen management, trying to help farmers use less nitrogen, use it more efficiently, use it more cautiously, better manage it, because it is such a large source of emissions. So Farmers for Climate Solutions proposed cost sharing so that farmers could work with agronomists to better understand that fertilizer and how to use it properly and more carefully. Second piece was cover crops. The proposal was to pay farmers to increase the adoption of cover crops, and those are a key part of regenerative agriculture. The third policy that was recommended was expanding rotational grazing, cost sharing with farmers for the planning of rotational grazing and the fencing infrastructure. And the video we just saw showed very well how rotational grazing works and how it fits. And the last piece was protecting wetlands and forests and just maintaining that biodiversity that is so key to healthy, sustainable food production systems. So a lot of what was asked for was delivered. Budget 2021 provided $200 million to support farmers to reduce emissions by better nitrogen management, more cover cropping, and better grazing. And also another $60 million was repurposed to protect trees and wetlands. And these programs are really key aspects of regenerative agriculture and agroecology. So while the emissions graph shows that emissions from agriculture are rising, it probably is the case that we're now turning the corner. We have a federal government that's taking this very seriously. Those people that are on this session today can help by really making this a priority for government, for really advocating for climate policies, because the more the government hears about the need for better climate policies, the easier it is for farmers and others to get the kind of policies we need to help make the changes we need to make on our farms. So I think I'm at time, and if you need more information, you can go to www.nfu.ca. The 2 reports that I referenced are on there. The Imagine If report especially is very readable, very positive, and really paints a picture not just of how agriculture can change, but also urban food systems and the entire food system for a lower emission, more diverse, and more health supporting food system for all of Canadians. So thank you very much. I'll just stop sharing here.
Darren, thank you so much for sharing with us. Thank you for all the knowledge that I did not have, and I'm really glad I have now. And I think for me, as someone in the youth climate movement, we are often asked once we've made enough noise to get attention, what are we asking for? And I don't think often enough we've had a clear layout of what we could be asking for farmers. So this was also very useful, I'll say, for me personally. And I think we're putting in the chat some resources for folks that want to follow that, and especially maybe the Imagine If report might be the best way, the best next step for people. So thank you, Darren, for this. We are getting to our last speaker today, and it's really a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce our speaker today. Not only have we already organized together, we've also had to have very friendly chats. So Rachel, it's great to see you. Rachel Parent is a youth activist whose passions include food and climate, social justice, animal rights, responsible consumption, and environmental protection. And in 2012, Rachel founded Kids Right to Know, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating youth about the connection between food production and climate change, with a focus on transparency in the labeling of genetically modified foods in Canada and in the US. Through over 10 years of work in the movement, she has been recognized for her work globally. And it's really nice to see you tonight, Rachel. Hope you're doing well. And let's take it away with your presentation. No, you're still on mute, as far as I can see. It's the youth today that don't know how to use Zoom. I like it.
There we go. It was saying that I was a participant, so I couldn't unmute myself. We had to change it up, make the young one not understand it. Anyway, thank you so much for the introduction, Allie. It's so great seeing you. And thank you for having me as a speaker here today. I'm really, really honored. I've been in the food system for over 10 years now, and working on various aspects from GMO labeling to climate change, soil health. And it has been a really fascinating journey. I think the thing that interests me about food the most is that it's one of the greatest connecting factors that we have. Each and every single one of us here tonight is a very different person, but the one thing that we do have in common is the need to eat. And beyond that, I feel that food brings people together. It's something that connects people. People watch a game while eating food. People connect over a dinner table. And in many ways, I feel that we do feel connected to food while we're eating simply through taste. But we've completely forgotten this deeper connection that we need to have with the origins of our food, where it's coming from, who is growing our food, and the impact that it's having. I want to encourage everyone quickly to just think back to the last meal you had and think about all of the ingredients that it took to make this, where it came from, and if it's something that you knew the farmer. Did you know the producer? Did you know the grower? Did you know who was involved in that entire process? And the answer is most likely no, in my case, for sure as well, unless you're growing the majority of our food. And at this point, it would be unrealistic for us to assume that everyone would have access or capacity to grow on your own piece of land. But while we've become distant from this food system and really forgotten our place in it, we've also started sourcing international imports rather than locally growing our food. We've really allowed these massive corporations to own and monopolize the entirety of our food system. So what I want to do today a little bit is just go through some of the history of our food system, how we've gotten to where we are today, and the impacts of very specific things that we are doing on a daily basis within this food system. And then from there, go into the solutions of regenerative agriculture and what we can do as consumers, but also what our government could be doing more, what corporations could be doing more, because they obviously need to be held accountable for what has happened to our food system. When people think of farming in general, I think the key thing that comes to mind is this beautiful farmhouse with a barnyard and growing vegetables and different types of fruits and maybe a couple cows and chickens. And that's where our meat and eggs come from. And the reality is, in this day and age, unfortunately, that's oftentimes not the case. Aside from some small organic regenerative farmers, the majority of the farms that we see are large-scale industrial and chemical agriculture here in Canada. It all sort of started around the 70s. Chemical herbicides came into rotation, chemicals like glyphosate, which is the key ingredient in Roundup. And Roundup is a common herbicide. You can actually still find it at your local Home Depot, your local Canadian Tire, and people are spraying this around their houses to get rid of weeds, basically. But our food is also being doused in this, and that's something that we seriously need to consider. To give a little context on where we are currently with glyphosate and Roundup, it is the #1 used herbicide in the entire world. There are currently about 300 million pounds of glyphosate being sprayed per year in the United States. And per capita, Canada sprays more. The WHO actually came out in 2015 and said that glyphosate was a probable carcinogen and may be causing cancer in those that are exposed. And this has been shown in the United States. I'm sure many of us have seen the over 120,000 cases of people coming forward saying they've been exposed to Roundup and glyphosate, and they now have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and various other types of cancers. So this is a really scary thing that's coming forward. And beyond that, we're starting to see cases that are not just about cancer. So going forward, it'll be really interesting seeing how this develops and how the science also follows that. A common misconception that I want to clear up quickly before I jump into GMOs and gene editing is the topic of where glyphosate is being sprayed. I think most people think that it's just with Roundup Ready soy, corn, canola, but in reality, it's also being sprayed on various other crops, including lentils, chickpeas, wheat. And they do this in order to dry it out before harvest, so it makes it a lot easier for the farmer. The problem is we're then ingesting straight residues, and this has become an ongoing thing that is concerning for many, many consumers, and why the push for organic foods and regenerative foods has become so wide. When Roundup and glyphosate were introduced in the 70s, this also started to open up the idea of creating genetically modified foods. And we saw that now we have genetically engineered foods that are resistant to herbicides, such as glyphosate. And this allows farmers to spray as much Roundup, as much glyphosate on the crop as they would like without having to worry about actually killing the plants that they're trying to grow. This is the problem, though. It's opened this insurgence of patented genetically modified Roundup Ready foods. And they were introduced in the late 90s and early 2000s. And since then, it's been a part of our lives in almost every processed food that we buy. Take a look in your pantry tonight before you go to bed, and you'll see most likely corn, canola, and soy are a very common ingredient. And sugar, which is often from sugar beet, is also largely genetically modified. Environmentally, this has provided huge problems. We are really patenting different varieties of nature. Patented foods has brought this increase of issues that we had really never seen before. And once this genetically modified organisms are released into nature, of course, there are no recalls. Genetic pollution and cross-pollination are all things that are going to happen inevitably. Many farmers that were growing these non-GMO varieties of corn, of canola, and soy, as well as other genetically modified foods, have run into massive legal problems. Because where they used to be able to grow it normally, now if their farmer next door is growing genetically modified seeds and it happens to cross-pollinate, they can now be sued for patent infringement. To sort of give a little metaphor, I find it's a little easier to understand as well. Let's say I had a house and I spray painted it purple. Some of that spray paint ended up on my neighbor's house. I could sue them for stealing my paint. Same kind of idea. Now, farmers that never asked for these genetically modified seeds, never asked to be a part of this process of owning and patenting nature, are having their lands taken away, are being sued for patent infringement. And this is happening around the world and is oftentimes affecting the most vulnerable communities first. Cross-pollination, in its own way, is slowly changing this entire food and genetic landscape. And it's becoming an ever-increasing issue with new gene editing techniques that are actually being employed around the world. And things like CRISPR that are coming out, new gene editing of plants and animals, almost every variety of seed or organism that we know of as of right now is being experimented with. And the amount of patent rights and biodiversity infringements that we could see in the future is simply astounding. If we really look at that, you could consider that we are basically changing the entirety of the code of life by patenting and changing DNA and releasing it into nature, fully knowing that it is going to cross-pollinate with other varieties. And so we need to start really looking at the consequences of that. all organic, conventional, and regenerative farmers would be in real danger if this was to become a reality, because almost every variety of food is being experimented with, and the integrity of organic regenerative foods would also be compromised. Unfortunately, the lovely government that we have right now, they're currently considering deregulation of gene-edited foods, meaning that they would give over the controls completely to corporations to self-regulate. And so, huge issue. I really encourage everyone to look into that. And if you want to take action on that issue, because it is something that we need to address very quickly, please head over to CBAN, which is the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network. And they have a petition currently where you can contact your local MP and ask them not to support deregulation of gene-edited foods, because this would pose major, major biodiversity threats. So that organization is called Canadian Biotechnology Action Network. Continuing, beyond the issue of genetic pollution, I think that there are also other things that we really have to consider with this genetic modification of our food. We've seen since the introduction of GMOs a massive increase in pesticides and herbicides in association. And of course, this is affecting our bees and butterflies, leading to colony collapse. Over the past 10 years, for instance, we've seen monarch butterfly populations decline by 90%, and our bees are going to colony collapse, and we're seeing issues with food pollination, where farmers are having to ship in bees by the hive just to be able to have enough pollination to create a crop. And this really stems from the fact that we are poisoning our earth. We are poisoning every species that is necessary to keep us alive in the effort to produce more food. But in reality, we are shooting ourselves in the foot, because this is not a long-term solution. This is a short-term Band-Aid solution. And so we really need to start realizing that if we want to produce more food, we need to be taking care of biodiversity, ecology, and our climate at the same time. There was a peer-reviewed study done recently that showed that there's currently more than 1 billion pounds of pesticides used in the United States every year. And 1 billion pounds, just think of that mentally, going into our soil, going into our water systems, and things that we are eating on a daily basis. Unfortunately, the plants and the animals that, or the insects that are meant to be affected by the exposure to chemicals are becoming resistant. And this leads corporations to then promoting and selling higher intensity and more dangerous alternatives that are going to continue to affect all generations to come. Way back when, we saw the government promoting DDT and all sorts of different chemicals, and those are still in our water systems. So only imagine now, with a cocktail of chemicals and pesticides, how damaging this can be for our soil, our water, and our bodies. All of these chemicals ultimately are ending up there. And what we have to understand, I think, is what we've forgotten. And I really appreciated what was being said earlier by Isaac about the fact that we've not appreciated Indigenous knowledge within agriculture nearly enough, because our environment is a complex puzzle piece. And when we abuse and manipulate nature, those pieces start degrading and falling apart. And that's where we are right now. We are in the middle of environmental degradation, where we are seeing our ecosystems collapse piece by piece. When we're growing these chemical intensive GMO crops for our processed food, for ethanol gas, for factory farmed animals, which is primarily where genetically modified foods go, we are really just overexerting this natural process of how our food should be made. For instance, we're growing really large imports of soy. Soy has become a huge necessity in our community, in our world right now, between feeding those who are vegan diets, such as myself, but also primarily going towards factory farmed animals. And in order to grow these high inputs of soy, we are really destroying even sensitive areas in our Amazon and precious land that is necessary for preserving this natural balance in our ecosystems. I'm sure most of us know, but 3 football fields per minute of our rainforests are being cut down. 3 football fields every minute are being cut down in order to grow industrial chemical agriculture. And this is happening all over the world, whether it's in the Amazon or whether it's in the United States or in Canada. Our soils are being destroyed in the process. We're growing monocultures of the same thing over large areas of land, and we're using high inputs of chemicals and doing crop after crop that way, and species are feeling the effects and our soil is feeling the effects. And when our soil is being damaged by all of these different practices, it's also releasing carbon as well. And this means that food has a huge, huge part to play in this entirety of a climate crisis. We've seen the climate crisis sort of begin to escalate. We've seen the signs, and I personally think it's very much impossible to ignore. Even for those who may not necessarily believe in climate change, it's hard to say that we can't see that there are deadly heat waves happening right now, record-breaking flooding. There's billions of dollars of crops being destroyed by never before seen storms, or 1 in every 500 year storms. And those are happening now every couple of years. Entire neighborhoods are being engulfed in flames, and that's never been seen before. South Africa and many other countries running out of water drastically, and pollinators and bees and birds are dying at very dramatic rates. These are really warning signs, and I think I've always held the sentiment that climate change isn't necessarily the issue. It's a symptom of the issue that we've caused. We are abusing our means here on Earth, mostly the corporations at this point and the government, and it's a symptom of what is happening all around us. On the agriculture side, there are rough estimates that are saying that food could be responsible for 44 to 57% of greenhouse gas emissions. And when you really start to break it down and you consider the amount of carbon dioxide created by burning tropical rainforests in the Amazon, which are considered partially the lungs of the world, in order to grow genetically modified soy, or you consider the nitrous oxide from too many chemical fertilizers being used, which ultimately makes its way into our oceans and contributes to ocean acidification, or even take a look at cows and what is being done with factory farming and how they're not being fed their natural diet, and how currently even studies are saying the average meat eater is responsible for about twice as much global warming as the average vegetarian, and close to 3 times as much as the average vegan. When you put all of that together, it's more than transportation, more than energy plants, more than some manufacturing. And yet it's not talked about nearly enough. And in between all of these different things, there's so much room for improvement, which I think holds a lot of hope. There's so much emphasis placed on fossil fuels as a leading cause, which is absolutely fair. It is one of the greatest polluters, emitters, and it needs to be talked about because the corruption within the oil and gas industry is absolutely devastating. But we also do need to understand that there are multiple causes to climate change. It's not necessarily just one thing. If food is not the entirety of climate change, fossil fuels are not the entirety. When we can start to look at it as a multi-system issue, then we can start to look at the solutions for each of these issues. And some of them include like fossil fuels, food, refrigeration, energy use, fast fashion, overconsumption. There's so many. But even as of today, if we were to cut out fossil fuels, there would still be so much carbon in the atmosphere that climate change would be a very relevant issue as well. And so in order to combat this, we do need to look for solutions. And there are many out there. One possible solutions that I think holds a lot of hope is regenerative agriculture. And I know that's why a lot of us are here today and we are talking about it. As I mentioned earlier, when we are damaging our soils, we are releasing carbon into the atmosphere. But the opposite is also true when we're nourishing and healing the soil. And that really has the capability to be a really powerful carbon sink. I do have a video that I can play about this.
Rachel,
I'm running short on time. I can finish up.
I'm gonna have to cut you off. But thank you.
Can I do like 1 more second?
We're like 3 minutes over time, so let's do 2 more.
Okay, that's fine. I'll just finish up by saying there are a lot of solutions, and with regenerative agriculture, we can help with feeding the world, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, local economies, all of it. It's really in our hands to try and choose differently when possible, but also demand more from our governments and corporations. And I think there is so much hope when it comes down to that. So I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the hopeful note at the same time. So this marks the end of the first part of this webinar. Now we're gonna get to actually ask some of your questions to our panelists. So if our panelists wanna put on their videos and get ready to answer some questions. Before that though, I do wanna tell you that this is the second webinar as part of a series of 3 webinars, and the third one will be happening on August 9th, and it'll be called Groundwork, Bridging the Rural-Urban Divide, Growing Our Future Together. And taking from the comments here, I think this will be relevant for some of you folks and some of your concerns. So I really encourage you to register already right now for the webinar on August 9th. So I'm gonna go into questions because there were many. If our folks are ready, yes, I see our speakers are back. One, and a few of you mentioned this theme, is that there are large barriers to regenerative agriculture because of inaccessibility of land ownership. And so people were asking in the chat, how can we address these barriers? There seems to be a need to address racist systemic issues, for example. How do we start to address these issues at scale? And is it even possible when the foundation of our economies are extractive and degenerative? So a pretty large question for you all. Does anybody want to start? Mary, yeah, thank you.
Acres.
There you go.
Oh, there, can you hear me now? Good. The 9,000 acres that we're trying to save, which are literally on the boundary of Toronto and right within the GTA, because they're owned by the federal government, they literally belong to us as Canadians. And one of our hopes and dreams, if we can stop the airport permanently and protect these lands for agriculture, is that these lands could be available to young farmers and to new farmers and to to new Canadian farmers for small scale farming, for regenerative farming, for all kinds of farming, because the biggest impediment to any kind of change in agriculture is access to land. Sure, young farmers can get land, way in the back and beyond, far away from the market, but that really doesn't help. It needs to be near the market, which our land is. And it needs to be, it could be used, rented to them long term, again, with sort of cooperative arrangements with the federal government. So that's one of the things that we're really pushing for, is to allow young farmers and young farmers who are going to farm in new, small ways, small farms, instead of right now. We've got most of the farmers on the lands, because they have these short-term leases. They have massive thousands of acres. And a lot of it, unfortunately, is corn, wheat, soy, right? So in order to get some of this good kind of agriculture that we're talking about here tonight, we need smaller farms and we need long leases, and that commitment by the federal government to do the kinds of things that the other speakers have been speaking about so eloquently.
Thank you, Mary. I also see in the chat some good suggestions about co-ops, land trust agreements. Wonderful. Maybe our other panelists also have an answer to this, something to add. Darren, yeah.
Yeah, I could just add, in our Imagine If report, we developed an idea much along the lines of what Mary was just saying, the idea of food sheds, that many cities in Canada could begin buying up the land in an area around them and turning that over to new farmers, young farmers, new Canadians, et cetera, to produce food for those cities. And what we also point out is we've had cities for about 5,000 years, and for about 4,900 years, those cities have been supplied by the food sheds around them. And it really is only in the fossil fuel era that we've managed to do something wholly different and wholly unsustainable, which is to supply our cities with food from hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of kilometers away. So we need to move back to that food shed idea.
Thank you. Very interesting. I don't know if Isaac or Rachel, you want to add? Otherwise, I have many other questions for you.
I have nothing to add just yet.
Okay, thank you. Well, actually, we had a question that was during your presentation, Isaac, and someone was asking, worms, they say worms might not be indigenous, but they are part of our soils now. Is it good to promote them?
Well, I will say this. At Evergreen Brick Works, we have the worm wranglers. So I promote worms. I tell people flat out, I tell them the truth. These worms, these red wigglers are an invasive species to this area. If you put them out on the ground, they're destroying our forest. So you have to make sure that when you're done with these worms, you're passing them on to somebody else. So I tell people flat out, use them up, use them. If they're here to help benefit, you're gonna have to use them because they're here already. Instead of letting them just go and do what they gotta do, we might as well use them for what we need to. And especially use them for indoor growing, for outdoor growing. If you're gonna use it use the compost, I make sure to tell people, if you can set them outside, like set outside on a hot sunny day to kind of like kill off some of the bacteria, maybe kill off some of the eggs inside the soil, so they're not growing inside when you put them outside. But I'd say flat out, use the worms because they're here. Use the European honeybees because they're here. We have to use them. They're not going anywhere. So they're part of our ecosystem now. We just have to make sure that we balance it out with the native species that are here. Because right now it's very unbalanced. The invasive species are heavy. Our native species are very, very low. So we got to balance that out. And that I'm trying to work on, which is kind of difficult.
That was pretty complex. I'm glad you're working on it. No, that's good to hear. And I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Now that things are here, what's our best use of them? Thank you for that. I don't know if other speakers have insights on this. Otherwise, many other questions. A question for Darrin mostly is agribusiness willing to adopt regenerative agriculture? Will this not affect their profits in the short term?
Yeah, there's good news and bad news. The bad news is corporations aren't willing to adopt it, and they also are willing to adopt it, and both pose problems. So we see around us a number of corporations pledging themselves to regenerative agriculture, but it's sort of a light version and not a complete version of regenerative agriculture. It's often just the status quo with chemical use and a few cover crops. So I think what farmers have to do is just kind of sidestep the whole corporate realm, whether they're opposing regen or supporting regen, and really implement a real biodiverse system of regenerative agriculture rooted in the ecological cycles and patterns.
Thank you. Other panelists maybe on this question of is it even possible? How does it clash with profits? Not for now. I did want to point out, this was less of a question, but I've seen it a few times, this theme. A few of us mentioned, or a few of you mentioned clean energy and renewables, and someone was pointing out, rightly so, that clean energy is not always clean for every community in the way it's done right now. We do know that racialized communities and Indigenous communities are most hurt, and it wasn't a question, but it was a recurring theme. So I wanted to highlight the comment of this person saying, if we continue to extract the way we do, we are not helping everyone. So hopefully we can be regenerative also of communities. There was a question that came in recently that was asking, what about indoor food growing in the winter to help replace long distance imports? What do you think of this?
I'll jump in with this one really quick. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. We have got to start utilizing more greenhouses, growing food inside your homes. If you look at what's happening in our climate, some years we're having a long winter. Some years we're having a short winter and a longer spring or longer summer. So we got to balance that out somehow, especially when it comes to our food. Because if we're going to have a long winter, our sun-loving plants will not be able to get outside unless we have them growing inside our homes or inside our greenhouses. Growing food inside your homes, I tell people flat out, that's one thing you need to do. If you have a beautiful south-facing window, grow some food in the window. I did that when I lived in Kensington Market. I had a south-facing window in my bedroom. I had cucumbers growing there. One year I had corn growing there. I was just growing stuff left, right, and center. It's to show people that you can actually do it. And guess what? If you do it in the middle of winter time, it's kind of cool to have a cucumber in the middle of winter time that's fresh. Or maybe I grew corn one year. The corn was very, very small, but I grew corn in the middle of winter time in my home. It's still there, it's still growing. You grow your lettuces, grow your greens, especially your greens in the wintertime. That's one thing we're lacking a lot of, is greens. So grow your greens in your house. It's very, very, very easy to grow. So I will say yes.
That sounds great, and it's true. We're heating our homes already. I think students should take that. We all love to have plants, so we should just have cucumbers instead. Any one of you have insights on this idea of growing in the winter foods inside? I don't know if there's nods or just nods of agreement with Isaac at this point. Rachel, is that you wanting to speak? No, not yet. Okay. We also had a question about certifications. For example, organic certification has meaning. Is there a regenerative agriculture certification program? Do you have any recommendations around that? Rachel.
As far as I know right now, there isn't a regenerative agriculture certification that is widely recognized. I do think that there is a need for a better definition and something that falls into it, just because we are slowly sort of shifting into this greenwashing moment of large corporations jumping onto the idea of regenerative agriculture without actually participating in regenerative agriculture and just using it as a marketing scheme, which we've seen with other forms of greenwashing in the climate movement as well. But even brands such as Impossible Burger using genetically modified soy and phrasing themselves as being regenerative and good for the environment. So I think there definitely needs to be a stricter regulation in some way in order to ensure consumers are getting good product.
Thank you, Rachel. Isaac, it looked like you had something to add on that initially when I asked the question.
When it comes to certification and stuff like that, I'm always okay. But who's going to be the most people who can be certified? Because it's going to come into race once again. Because it's going to be those who are low income, those people of color, who most likely won't get the certification that they need. And it's going to be people who are the rich who get the certification. So whenever I hear certification, I was like, ooh, who is this really benefiting? Is it benefiting us? Is it benefiting the big business? Is it benefiting the government? And so I think when we do certification, we have to actually sit back and look and take a really good look at certification, especially when it comes to organic. Because in the beginning of the whole organic thing, it was, you can be certified. Sure, you're certified, but then you go next door to the farm next to you and that farm's not certified. So because you're certified, does that mean you're now no longer certified? So we have to really think about that when we go to this sort of certification thing, because once again, it's going to go to the elite, to the people at the top. That's our structure for some odd reason.
Yeah, we could get into debates about our governance structures, but we don't have that much time on this webinar. I saw another question from Josephine, who was actually a speaker on our first webinar, asking for folks, for example, with mixed heritage, how can you align movements like the Black movements and Indigenous food sovereignty? How do you overcome the divide and conquer tactics that have maybe been used before? Any insights on just alignments of movements, maybe more generally as well for others?
Well, it always goes. The first thing that goes and pops in my head when it comes to that is listen. Listen to what the Indigenous and Black people are saying, and that's one of the biggest things out there, that we're not being heard. I mean, sure, we're being heard now, somewhat, not all the way, but we're not being heard. We're either told, no, you got to do it this way, or your way is wrong, or you do it this way to get money for it, right? But just listen to us. Listen to us. We have some knowledge that we are willing to share. And I always tell people, listen to us now, because one day we're going to do this. We're done. Figure it out yourself.
Thank you. Okay, we are running out of time, but I'm gonna ask something that might be very difficult for you to just think about on the spot. But I'm thinking if you're taking away maybe 1 to 3 words from today, or it's something, just a few words that summarize our event, the things you talked about or someone else talked about, what would they be? And maybe I can start with you, Darren, and then we'll move around. I know this is a difficult exercise to do on the spot.
3 words, farmers and non-farmers together.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Wow. Did you prepare that? Rachel.
Oh boy.